Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today we are talking about the 1847 classic novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And today I am joined on the stile on the way into town by no one. This is a solo episode. I'm, trying out a new format today where it's just me physically in the studio. But digitally, I am not alone because I'm going to be listening to some voicemails that you all sent in about this wonderful book, and including a truly unhinged one by friend of the show, Will Whitwer. He never ceases to disappoint and dazzle with his turns of phrase and his general kind of joie de vivre. So stick around for that. But before we get into all of this, well, first of all, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the patrons. We're having a little kind of, I'm calling it a faculty meeting because the names of the tiers are college-based. Anyway, at the end of this episode, on the Patreon version, we're going to have a little chat about kind of the book club and how we want to move forward. So if you want to hear that discussion, I mean, I guess it's a discussion. It'll just be me talking, but the call to a discussion, if you will, if you want to stick around for that, you can get the ad-free extended version of this podcast, of this episode, and all episodes, over on the Patreon, patreon.com/Shoulda Books. So I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been following along on Fable, the Shoulda Book Club. You can find that over on Fable. I'm always blown away by the insights that you all bring and the discussions that you have. And it's so fun to, as I'm reading along this book, and look, I'll be honest, I had to cram. I did not manage my time in the best, most efficient way. And so the last kind of week, I have just been mainlining this book into my brain, and no complaints, really. I mean, I ended up really liking this book, spoiler alert. But I was able to, kind of checking in to see how people were liking it. A lot of folks completely outstripped me. They finished the book weeks before I did. And I was like, well, I can't go read their comments if I haven't read the book because it'll get spoiled. On the topic of spoilers, this is going to be a very spoiler-full discussion. So if you haven't read the book and you're worried about spoilers, this is probably not the episode for you. But if you have read the book, or if you don't care about spoilers, I think we're going to have a good time. So before we get into all of that, though, I got to do the synopsis. And that, of course, requires the synopsis voice. Hold on. Brought up the wrong file. Here we go. Set in the north of England during the Regency period of Bridgerton fame, Jane Eyre is the coming-of-age story of its titular heroine, Jane Eyre, following her from her heartbreaking childhood as the unwanted orphaned ward of her aunt to her traumatizing stint at a tyrannical boarding school into her young adulthood, where she takes a job as a governess for the brooding, eccentric, and fabulously wealthy Mr. Rochester. She soon divulges... Nope. She soon develops feelings for her employer, but as she falls for him, she starts to suspect that he's hiding a terrible secret. This is Jane Eyre. So normally I print that out and there's like rustling of paper, but maybe I'll add that in post. I really enjoyed this book. I did not at first. When I started this book, I was like, oh God, what have I done? This book is so boring. It's so sad and it's so dry. This is going to be terrible. I've asked all these people to read this book, and I've asked myself to read this book. And when am I going to have to find the time? It's 500 freaking pages long, but it got better. It got a lot better. But the first kind of section is incredibly sad. Jane is this little orphaned girl. Her parents have both died, and she's now living with her aunt, who does not like her. Her aunt took her in. It's her, let's see if I can remember this. It is her mother's brother. It was her mother's brother's her uncle who married Mrs. Reed. So this is great podcasting, me just trying to call up a family tree. Anyway, she's living with her aunt. Her aunt doesn't like her. Her aunt's not related by blood, but she's kind of fulfilling a promise to her dead husband by watching after young Jane. And she just hates this little girl who, like, Jane is, well, I'll go ahead and say one of my favorite things about Jane as a character is how much respect she has for herself. She is someone who knows what she wants. She knows how she wants to be treated, and she's not afraid to ask for it. She's not afraid to stick up for herself. And that starts when she is a little girl. And she has a lot of occasions to do that because she's treated so horribly. And so the book kind of starts with her being punished for something she didn't do by being made to go sit in the red room. Now, I wasn't quite sure what a red room was. And I'll tell you this, Googling it, you're going to get some other definitions of what a red room is. It's not that one, okay? That's not what this podcast is about. It's not about that shit. It's about the other thing, which is, I guess, in this era of England, which again, the Regency period was kind of the first, roughly speaking, the first 20 years of the 19th century. It refers to the end of George III's reign, where he was kind of not altogether with it. And so there was a regent, I believe his brother, let me know in the comments if that's correct, who is kind of ruling in his stead. Anyway, it directly precedes the Victorian era. So during this time, houses had what they called a red room, which was often decorated in red and was used as kind of like a socializing, I guess a living room is what you would call it. So anyway, so I had to look that up. And poor Jane, when she gets locked in there, she is like, believes she's haunted by the ghost of her uncle, and it like completely traumatizes her. And so, so the first kind of section of this is her just being terribly mistreated by her family, who don't even really consider her family. Like they're so mean to her. My parents read this book or are in the process of reading this book. Shout out mom and dad. And my mom made the comparison that this was very similar to Cinderella. And I was like, oh my God, that's totally correct. Because, you have this young woman who's just horribly mistreated. She's like forced to kind of do the work and stuff. She doesn't really do the chores in here. They have servants for that, which we're going to get into all that. But it's still, the dynamic is there that like, she is family, but she's not treated well. And the person who was kind of her protector has since passed. From there, she basically she drives her aunt to the point where her aunt is like, okay, you got to get out of the house. We're sending you to school. So she gets sent to this boarding school called Lowood. And man, that place really seems like it sucked. It was, it's this place that is incredibly draconian in its rules. It's extremely strict in its religion, and a bunch of kids die from typhus and tuberculosis, otherwise known as consumption. She makes a friend. She's such a lonely kid. It's so heartbreaking. She has no friends, but she finally makes a friend, Helen, and then Helen ends up dying from consumption. Interestingly enough, earlier this year I read John Green's Everything is Tuberculosis, which is super fascinating, and I learned a lot about tuberculosis. I could get into all that right now, but I'm not gonna, because I got to stay focused. All right, I don't have a guest kind of keeping me on the straight and narrow. I gotta rein myself in here in the beautiful dining room studio. So we're gonna stay on target, Star Wars style, and keep plugging ahead. I just rewatched all the original Star Wars movies, and man, I really want to talk about them. And that's popping up into my head right now too. But no, I will prevail. Okay, just like Jane, I'm gonna be determined, and I'm gonna go after what I want. From there, so anyway, after her friend very tragically dies, Jane stays at the school for a number of years. She graduates, she becomes a teacher there, but then she grows tired of it. In the same way that I was kind of tired of these sections happening. And look, no offense if you really enjoyed these sections. I don't deny that they have literary merit. They do. I just was not, they didn't really resonate with me, and that's just on me. But once she is 18, she decides that she wants she wants something new. So she puts an ad in the newspaper for advertising herself as a governess, which, basically a private tutor, someone, it's a little more than a tutor. It's someone who's kind of, in charge of the kids of generally rich people. So she gets hired. She responds to an ad, and she moves into the north of England to Thornfield Hall. Let's see. Survey says Thornfield Hall, not Thornfield Manor, Thornfield Hall. And which is this huge Gothic kind of spooky mansion that's owned by this kind of mysterious, eccentric, brooding. So much. It's Bronte. He's a Bronte boy. He's gonna brood. Bronte boys are gonna brood. And she doesn't. She takes the job. She doesn't meet him at first. She's working there for a little bit before Mr. Rochester comes home, and when she does meet him, she ends up falling in love with him. Which, falling in love with your boss. It's let's just say there was not an HR department at Thornfield Hall, and there probably should have been. But from there, once good old Edward Fairfax Rochester, once he shows up, then I found this. I feel like the story really kind of accelerated, because you start to see, like, she finally has, in some ways, like almost like a proper adversary, someone who's kind of on her level and can like go toe to toe with her. And so you have these really great extended dialogue scenes of them kind of verbally sparring and also kind of flirting. It's really delightful. I really enjoyed the kind of interplay between the two of them. And as this is happening, some spooky stuff is starting to happen. I was really surprised. So my expectations coming into Jane Eyre, I honestly, I didn't know much. I didn't know much about the story. I knew a little bit about Charlotte Bronte just from doing research on the Wuthering Heights episode, which I did back when this podcast was part of Try Guys. So I knew a little bit about Charlotte. I knew that she had worked as a governess, but I didn't really know what the book was about, and I didn't realize like how spooky the book would be, because once she's at Thornfield Hall, I keep wanting to call it Thornfield Manor, but that's not correct. Thornfield Hall. Once she's there, she starts hearing this like terrifying laugh that comes from the attic or whatever, and she starts. There's this this scene where she wakes up in the middle of the night and she smells smoke, and she runs in and sees that Mr. Rochester's room has been set on fire, and she saves his life. She puts out the fire, and he basically just like sweeps it under the rug. He's like, "That's nothing. One of my servants did it. It's fine." And she's like, "What?" And which this is actually one of kind of it opens up a huge thing I want to talk about. We'll get to that later. But the fact that like Jane just kind of like goes with it. She's like, okay. Like, it's like someone set the dude's room on fire. Like, how are you not freaking out more? Like I was like, Jane, you need to be freaked out a little bit more. But the kind of the Gothic elements, and I guess I had heard this book described as a Gothic book before, but I feel like it's not generally. I feel like it's not as Gothic as some of the other Goths, like for instance, Frankenstein or Wuthering Heights for that matter. But I really enjoyed that kind of spooky element of it. Okay, so rather than kind of rehashing the entire plot, which I could do, but I find that's not super interesting. Let's kind of dive into some of these main characters. So I've already talked about Jane a little bit, and I found her so compelling. Like, she is so independent. She's so strong. She knows who she is. And like, I think one of the best kind of signs of good writing when it comes to characters is when the story's progressing and a situation is presented and you already know, you're like, oh, I think Jane is going to react this way. And she does, but not all the time. Because that's how people are, right? Where it's like, generally, you can kind of guess how, the people closest to your life are going to react in a given situation. You can kind of guess that like, oh, if X happens, like my partner, for instance, is going to respond in, X way, but not every time. And I thought that like this book did a great job of like letting me know who Jane is and kind of what Jane is all about, what she stands for, what she believes in, and presenting situations where I'm like, at first, like, oh, I know, obviously she's going to make this decision, but then she doesn't make that decision. She makes a different decision. Or she confirms, she goes, yep. And you're like, yep, that's so Jane, And so like, it just really made her feel like such a real character. I loved it. I loved like spending time. And then look, it's a lot of time, okay? It's a long book. It's 500, this version, 521 pages. That's not counting footnotes, which, by the way, okay, the footnotes in this fucking edition, this is the Penguin Classics. So, let's get into the Bertha of it all, okay? So the kind of the big secret that Mr. Rochester is keeping is that he's married, has been this whole time, and his wife, who everyone claims is a lunatic, is locked in his attic. He has a prisoner here at Thornfield Hall. He has her under lock and key because he claims she's crazy. And the book kind of, we'll get into this a little bit more, but everyone who knows about it kind of agrees that this woman is just kind of crazy. Anyway, there was a footnote in the Penguin Classics edition that spoiled the fact that Rochester was married. Before that, this is in the lead up. So he proposes to Jane, which structurally comes at an interesting time because it's around the midpoint. He asks Jane to marry him, and you're like, oh wow, there's still 250 pages of the book left. Where is this going to go? I bet something bad's going to happen. And there was like a footnote that revealed like, oh yes, Mr. Rochester's already married, and I was like, what the fuck, Penguin? Why would you do that? So, luckily, it was like half a chapter before it was actually revealed in the text. So, I didn't have to sit in that spoiler territory so long. But it made me like think twice before checking the footnotes, which normally I'm a footnote freak. A footnote. I don't like that. I don't like how that sounded. Maybe I'll cut that. Normally I like footnotes, but I was kind of scared to continue with that. And speaking of continuing, I want to continue and kind of, talking about some of these characters. But before we do that, let's listen to a voicemail. Let's listen to the one that our good friend Will Whitwer left.
So Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a book I read in high school. And honestly, really I think it's good. I haven't read Wuthering Heights, which I know you said on our episode was better, and I'm sure that is true. But
we'll come back to that.
First of all, Mr. Rochester. You think about a barrel chest, you think about him. I think, a strong man. Only he has a secret. His wife is crazy and locked up in the attic.
Okay, well.
He's the perfect man.
Why are you laughing?
He's otherwise so perfect. And ultimately, the book sort of makes the claim that it's not his fault, that he had to put her up there. And I don't really remember how it all sort of symbolically comes together or not, but I believe there's at least some readings about like what it has to say about women at this time or whatever. I don't even remember the house burning down and that his wife is locked up. And those being these big gothic reveals. I shouldn't laugh. I guess it's not funny, at all. In that, imprisoning women. I'm not in favor of that, and I just want to come out and say that actually it's bad, and maybe we shouldn't imprison women in the attic. I don't know if that's the message of the book, but that's what I remember. Okay, bye.
Yeah, that is true. Will, we do not support imprisoning women in the attic. God. we talked about this a little bit on the episode that Will did, where I was like, okay, we should have a segment where you try to remember the plot of movies without having seen them, and like explain the plot of movies without having seen them. I think this could be a fun segment too, of just like Will recalls the plot of a book that he hasn't read in years. But no, he got some of the details right. Barrel chested isn't necessarily what comes to mind when it comes to Mr. Rochester. And that's what I want to pivot into, is the Mr. Rochester situation. I do think it's hilarious how often she says he's not handsome. She makes that very clear that this is not a handsome guy, which is interesting because I know that, there's been many adaptations. There's going to be a new adaptation, just got announced that there's going to be a new miniseries, I think. But anyway, there was a 2011 film starring Michael Fassbender as Mr. Rochester. And it's like, guys, come on. Michael Fassbender, like that is a handsome man. I'm sorry. He's too handsome to play Mr. Rochester. It's kind of a tough thing as an actor. One of those things of like, oh, you know who you'd be perfect for? You'd be perfect for this character that is famous in literature for not being handsome. I guess the same is true for Jane too, because like, she says, she's the narrator, but she's always talking about how she's not pretty, which I feel bad for Jane. But Miss Rochester thinks she's pretty. So, that's one of, he's to say this guy's a complicated guy is an understatement. He is, he's not without his charms. He's definitely like kind of prickly when you first meet him, but like he has a sense of humor. He's eccentric. He's, he kind of in a kind of a mirror image sort of, or a inverse image sort of way, like kind of like Jane, in that like he marches to the beat of his own drum. That being said, like as a romantic prospect, it's like, God, the number of red flags, like the whole reason Jane is there is to teach this young woman, Adele, who like is probably Rochester's daughter. He's not even like 100% sure. I think he thinks that Adele is his daughter, but basically she is the child of one of his former mistresses who ended up cheating on him, and that who he like cut off. And so he has a checkered past. That's at least the part of his checkered past that he volunteers to Jane. The huge part of his checkered past is what we touched on already, which is the fact that dude is freaking married. He is married to this woman named Bertha. She is from, I believe it's Jamaica. Again, let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But she's from kind of the British colonies in the Caribbean. And according to him, I don't know why I say it like that. According to him, he was kind of bamboozled into marrying Bertha. He was kind of set up by his father and Bertha's father. And in his telling, it sounds like he has no agency at all. And it's like, okay, citation needed. But he marries this woman and then whoops, finds out, oh my goodness, she's a lunatic. Guess I got to imprison her in the attic. It's like, look, mental illness is real. And it sounds like her family had a history of it. And I guess, the state of mental health in Regency freaking England, probably pretty dire. It's not great today, no matter where you are, but like, I'm sure it was freaking way worse. But it's like, there had to be another solution other than just like making her your personal prisoner, And the fact that he hides this from Jane is pretty despicable. One of those instances that I talked about earlier where like, she's put in these positions where you're like, I know who she is and I know what she believes in, but now she's faced with like a really tough choice. Because basically he asks her to marry him and she says yes. And they're at the altar. And then, at the moment of, speak now or forever hold your peace, someone, hello, actually, I know that this man has a wife, and it all comes out. And so after that, Rochester's like, look, Jane, I still love you. I still want to be with you. Come just live with me. And, we won't be married in the eyes of the law, but like within the eyes of each other, we'll be married. And Jane is a very strict Christian, and she doesn't believe that that's right. And she doesn't want to just be another one of his mistresses that he then, either locks in the attic or, abandons and cuts off like he did Adele's mother. So she makes a really tough choice, which is to just leave. And she has nowhere to go. She has no money of her own. She has no possessions of her own. And she literally, that doesn't stop her. Like she is so committed to her morals, and she's so sure of who she is that like she makes this choice that like, God, that's a tough choice to make. Like this guy's offering you a life of luxury and ease after she's had this incredibly hard life, full of hardship and want and loneliness. He's offering her companionship. He's offering her freaking wealth. And she says no. She says no. And so she wanders into the wilderness, into the cold moors of England. She wanders onto the set of Wuthering Heights. Basically, that's what happens. She wanders up there and she ends up, finding refuge. She gets taken in by these kindly strangers who, plot twist, I love there's some plot twists in here that like are that feel trite now, because I think so many things have been inspired by this book. The plot twist is that like, oh, actually they're your long lost cousins. And so now she has this family. And then she also has the trope of like, distant rich uncle dies, leaves her a fortune. It's like, I don't know. I found it really fun. I found it incredibly icky that her cousin wants to marry her. Now, if you saw the Wuthering Heights episode that I did last year when this was part of Try Guys, we talked about the cousin loving. Okay, it was a thing back then. I don't support it. the official stance of Shoulda Books is that incest is not good, but it was very common back then, and so no one seems to really bat an eye that like her first cousin is like, I want to marry you, but there is a catch. I mean, other than the genetic one, the catch is that he just wants her. He's going to be a missionary, and he's like, actually, you'd make a really good kind of helper, make a really good partner, and you'd get to serve the Lord. And so again, she's faced with yet another choice that, I mean, for me, this would be an easy choice to say no to, but he's playing on the fact of like her beliefs and her religion and her sense of duty. But again, she says no. She says, no, that's not me. I couldn't live with myself if I did that. And so she says no to him. She's now rich. She's independently wealthy. She's a woman of means. So she inherits 20,000 pounds, which I was like, that doesn't sound like a whole lot. Turns out 20,000 pounds at that time is roughly equivalent to like $2.5 million. So like, that's a lot of money. That's enough money. Like you're not going to live extravagantly for the rest of your life, but you're not going to have to work for the rest of your life. And so now she is an independently wealthy person. She still loves Mr. Rochester. She still loves him. And so she goes back to Thornfield Hall. She finds out that, crazy Bertha set the place on fire. And Rochester got wounded in the process of that. He's lost his eyesight and he's lost a hand. And he's living at his other house. I mean, again, like I said, this guy's incredibly wealthy. This book is I think kind of takes an uncritical look at class structure of the time, and I just was like reminded over and over, just like, oh my God, like the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? There's this whole class of people who do not work; they just own, and that is true in our day as well. They just have a lot better PR. I think back then they were like, yeah, we don't have to do any sort of messaging about this. This is just our God-given right. And, fuck you. So, it was a little icky in that regard. We can get into that in a little bit. But anyway, she finds Mr. Rochester, and now she agrees to marry him because it's on her terms. And he's no longer married because Bertha died. She jumped off the roof during the house fire. So that obstacle is taken out of the way, and it has a happy ending. How I feel about the ending, I'm glad that Jane seems really happy at the end. It's undeniable. She seems really happy. I personally was like disappointed that she went back with Rochester. I didn't think he deserved it, but she did what she wanted to do. She did what made her happy, and she did it on her terms. And so I think, you got to respect the Jane for that. And so, so I was a little disappointed in that aspect of the ending, but like, it was nice to have a happy ending, And again, I think that so many things have been inspired by this that it's interesting to kind of see, like, that's one of the kind of the meta projects of this podcast is like re-examining classics and seeing where tropes come from, seeing where familiar story beats, I guess that's the same as a trope, seeing where those things come from. And so this book, so much of the DNA of romance stories, I think, comes from this book. I mean, also from Pride and Prejudice, and I think a lot of this book came from from Jane Austen, because Jane Austen was, kicking it before the Brontes. So, God, that was cringy. Anyway, that is how I felt about the ending, Jane Eyre. Let's circle back to Bertha. I found it a little hard to kind of parse how the author felt about this character. Because there's the way that the characters within the story feel about her, which is they just kind of like take it, they take Mr. Rochester at his word that like, oh, she's crazy. Was she? Like I can't help but feel that like feel bad for this woman, and wonder kind of what her story is. And I certainly was not the only person who felt this way. There's a book from 1966 called Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rees. I don't know how to pronounce the author's name, but that's what it is on paper. That it's basically like a prequel to Jane Eyre that is about Bertha and Mr. Rochester and like how they got together, and it's like from Bertha's perspective. So I'm super interested to read that book. But within this book, within Jane Eyre, I think the book is certainly an early feminist piece. There's undeniable of just like, Jane is someone who is questioning like why she has to be in this like subservient position, why she's oppressed. Her critiques and her rebellion are very personal. They're not like she's not necessarily rebelling against systems, which I think is interesting. And she certainly stops short of calling for any sort of racial equality or any sort of class equality too. So I would have certainly liked it more if there had been that element of it. But my kind of read on this is that like the author is more or less kind of fine with the racial hierarchies of the day. That was my interpretation. Maybe you had a different interpretation, and we can hop into the comments and discuss that. But speaking of race, like Bertha, she's described as a Creole, and so researching this term, I don't know if that term is offensive now. It might be. I'm certainly not going to use it outside the context of this. But within the context of this, it refers to someone who is from the Caribbean, but of European, i.e. white descent. But it can also imply like kind of a more mixed ethnicity. And so, the actual ethnicity of Bertha isn't clearly stated. It seems to imply that she is not white. Some of the descriptions, some of the ways that Jane, the narrator, describes seeing Bertha, you read that and you're like, I don't think this is a white woman, which makes it even more fucked up. It makes it so, just so icky that, because at the time, like this story is set during the height of at least in the United States, the like transatlantic slave trade. in Britain, I know Britain outlawed the slave trade earlier, much earlier than the United States did. But regardless to say, like, racism was institutionally backed at the time. You can see a lot of that. Like, there's some very casual anti-Semitism that kind of comes out of nowhere. Like, Jane is just talking and she just says like some pretty horrific things about Jewish people, just literally kind of out of nowhere, and you're just like, what? And again, it's just like reflecting what was kind of beliefs that were in vogue at the time, which is freaking sad. But with Bertha, they talk so much about like, oh, it's congenital, like her madness is congenital. And it's like, it brings up the issue of like, are they implying that her race played into that? Because that was another belief that was, big at the time, which is that like, people who were not of like quote unquote pure, white European ancestry, like were inferior, which, is I would say is obvious today, but considering the state of the world, I think that thinking has made a resounding comeback, or rather it just never really left. It's just now people feel empowered to talk about it in public. But the racial element of it is troubling. The one of the things one of the kind of the rabbit holes I went into in researching, I said it like a British person, in researching this book was the pseudoscience of physiognomy. Charlotte Bronte spends a lot of time describing people's faces in this book, and she uses the term too, the physiognomy of someone's face. It was this, again, pseudoscience bullshit, like school of thinking that was like, you could tell a person's character by their physical appearance. It's literally judging a book by its cover. And this stuff was kind of at its height in Europe. It's kind of, look, this stuff's been around since like the ancient Greeks. They talk about this kind of pseudoscience. But it had a kind of a revival in Regency and early Victorian Britain of this idea of just like, yeah, you could look at a person's face and you could tell, oh, your forehead is like this, that means that you are good with money, or like some bullshit like that. And so there's a lot of ink is spilled in this book describing people's faces from that perspective. And again, that is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of this thing of like, looking at physical appearance and using that as a justification for the hierarchies of the time. And that was disappointing, but it's like, it's a book from the 19th century. What are you going to expect, So wish that wasn't the case, but it is. And it also made me realize I've in my kind of perusal of physiognomy, realizing that it's actually very relevant to right now, because they're seeing, I found this really interesting article, I'll put a link to it in the description, talking about large language models, machine learning, facial recognition software, and how the biases that have been imported into that are kind of like making decisions in almost a physiognomy sort of way of just like, oh, we can use facial recognition software to scan people, and because their face fits this sort of pattern, that means we can deduce that that person is blank. That person is this, and it's like, no, it's bunk. It's not true. And so I think it's a conversation we need to have of making sure that some of these, that just this fucking ignorance doesn't get, imparted to these machines. I mean, we should burn the machines. That's what that's the official stance of Shoulda Books. Burn the machines, except for the ones that are obviously letting you listen to this podcast. But yeah, I found that super fascinating that like this bullshit pseudoscience is making a comeback in a strange way. And it also goes into like, people talking about like freaking looks maxing. Like that sort of shit is like, it's all part of that same thing, which is just looking at the surface, instead of looking at what is within. Let's listen now to another voicemail. This one is from Julie, one of our patrons. Thank you, Julie. And here we go.
Hi, Jonathan. Here to leave my voicemail about Jane Eyre. My thoughts about the book were that the beginning was very slow. It felt like she would
Mm-hmm.
never turn into an adult, and I was very
Yep.
thankful when she left for the school. I found that more
Yep.
interesting,
Couldn't agree
especially
more.
learning more about like the community in that time period through the school, especially like
Mm-hmm.
what life was like for women. Um, I also thought it was really interesting that there was a lot of emphasis on ghosts and the unexplained. I mean, it makes sense for the time
Mm-hmm.
period, but that seemed to be a big center of things, especially as it relates to religion. You know, religion seemed to be a very big form of solace for Jane, like throughout her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's something that is very relatable, like to the modern reader, but I do think it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to look at in like that historical context specifically. I read like a annotated copy, and like on a Kindle, so it was really easy to access the annotations. And that was really helpful for understanding the book
I wonder if they
and some of
spoiled
the things that
anything.
definitely would have flown over my head better. I was not a fan of the romance. I think her going back to the first guy at the end was a little weird, especially with how much he lied to her. And
Yep.
kind of the ending of the story was like, hey, she gets to take care of someone again. Great for women, you know, love to
Yeah.
take care of people.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall
Yeah.
it was an interesting book and I enjoyed it, but I don't think I'd read it again just because it was a bit slow. I'm not sure if this voicemail is too long, but I'm very much enjoying
No,
the
it's not.
podcast and I hope things go well for you. All right, thank you and have a good day.
Well, thank you, Julie. Yeah, I think you made some great points, and it sounds like we agree on some of these issues, especially with like the ending. That's such a good point too about like, yeah, it ends with like her happy ending is she now gets to be the caregiver for Mr. Rochester. Again, it's like, okay, if Jane's happy, then I'm happy, but also it's like it's a little kind of sad. It's interesting talking about the religion aspect of it. The role of religion in this book was really fascinating, where the experience that Jane has when she is a young girl at Lowood is quite bad. Quite bad, I would say, and it's all kind of tinged in a religious. All of the deprivations that she faces at this bad school are kind of all in the name of Christianity, and so I was surprised that she was as religious in her adulthood or young adulthood as she was. But some people that is what some people are into, and so it's not something that I relate to, but I think it like got her through some really tough times, and so and I think it helps a lot of people get through a lot of tough times. Okay, so before we wrap up, this is Bronte month. This is the end of Bronte month. We got to talk a little bit about Jane Eyre versus Wuthering Heights. So Will brought this up in his voicemail that when I saw him last, I was in that kind of first 150 pages or so, and I was like, I do not like this book. My opinion has changed, and I enjoy it a lot. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. I still think if I had to choose, and this is the choice I'm putting before myself, if I had to choose one, I think I'm still choosing Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is kind of the, in they came out in the same year. In 1847, Wuthering Heights is the 1847 version of like an A24 film, and Jane Eyre is the 1847 version of like a big studio crowd pleaser. And like, you know me, I'm going to choose the freaking A24 edgy movie. That's just who I am. They're both great though. They both are really great. I think that in terms of like, if we're going Rochester versus Heathcliff, they, to say the least, both have their issues, but I think Rochester is he's not cruel. The Bertha situation aside, he doesn't think that he's being cruel. I think he is being cruel, but in his mind, he's not being cruel. Whereas Heathcliff, relishes in being cruel. And so I think that's an important distinction. I think it's interesting to think of whether both of these guys were based on the same person, because sisters growing up together, they both write books that have these kind of brooding characters who share some similarities. It makes one wonder, but who knows? Who knows? And I think that if you like your stories like twisted and dark, I think Wuthering Heights is the way to go. If you like your stories, a little more happier, but like with more emotional, like a closer experience of being in someone's head, I think that Jane Eyre is the one for you, because like this book really, we don't really have time to get into it, but it really revolutionized first person storytelling by kind of making the bulk of the story be about the protagonist's inner life. She's relating events, obviously, but more importantly than relating events, she's relating how she feels about these events. And again, this is something that is like, we take it for granted today because that's just the way that so many stories are. But at the time, this was revolutionary. And so, again, it's so fascinating to kind of go back and read the original, like the original, the thing that inspired so many things. And the famous quote from this book, "Reader, I married him," that has inspired, I mean, so many different things. Again, there's so much like DNA of like modern rom-coms that is in this book. And so I think it is absolutely worth checking out. I think it is a book you should read. And I'm glad I read it. And I'm thankful for everyone who did read it. Thank you for being there and making it through those first 150 pages or so. If you want to stick around and hear this little kind of extra discussion about like what the format of the book club is going to look like, you can get that on Patreon. If you want ad-free extended versions of all the episodes, you can get that on Patreon. If you want the short stories that I write every month, you can get those on Patreon. And if you want to vote in the upcoming ballot of books, which will be coming up at the end of March, you can get that on Patreon. And speaking of March, the March Shoulda book of the Shoulda Book Club is going to be The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I still don't have a copy of it. I still got to get it. I will get it, and I will start reading it, and I will try to read it in a more efficient way than I did Jane Eyre. But you know what? It's all just like this book. It all works out in the end. So thank you to everyone for watching and listening. And as always, keep reading.